It's been 5 years. What was the biggest surprise over 5 years? You moved from Dartmouth to the World Bank, this gigantic bureaucracy, almost as bad as herding the cats in the faculty at Dartmouth. What's been the biggest surprise over 5 years?
You know, Tom, first of all, thanks for having me back on. And for me, the biggest surprise is just how powerful financial tools are in fighting poverty. I mean, I had some sense of them,
right,
but I didn't know that the combination of leverage and swaps and hedges and political risk insurance and guarantees, how powerful those instruments, absolutely.
Yeah,
you know, and so I had to learn both macroeconomics and finance, but in learning those two, the tools that the rich use every day to make themselves wealthier are just as useful in trying to lift people out of poverty.
This tells me that you should have taken a few more courses at Tuck in your free time up at Dartmouth. Let me go to a new project of the World Bank, which has my attention because I look at the mystery of a decline in productivity within the major countries, including the United States. And this goes back to Dale Jorgensen at Harvard, which is human capital, the idea of a human capital project. That's translated to the World Bank in what way? What does human capital mean?
So we use the term human capital because we want to be very clear that this is a huge part of the wealth of nations. We're writing a report now called The Changing Wealth of Nations, where we show that in fact human capital in terms of overall wealth is more than 60% of the existing wealth in the world. And so what we wanted to do was to really take a hard look at the connection between health outcomes, not health expenditures, health outcomes and educational outcomes, not years of schooling alone, but whether you're actually learning things, and then do a regression to look at the correlation with growth over the last 25 years.
There?
So we found that it's far more powerful than we ever thought. Using very sophisticated methods, the same methods that Google and others use to do searches, we found that if you look at the top 25% of countries that have improved human capital and the bottom 25% who've not, over a 25-year period, it's 1.25% of GDP per year. Now, that is only going to get more powerful going forward as the economies become more digitized. So for us, you know, the countries themselves decide what loans they want to take. And what we found is that they're not focusing enough on investing in human beings, health, education, as drivers of economic growth.
And I'm going to rip up the script here. This is so important with Dr. Kim, and this will go to our conversation with Madame Lagarde in a minute. Your unique tension with the Trump administration, because what you're seeing is a widening inequality in education and the opportunities that are out there, and you have an administration in America, your largest donor, which is really pushing back against your projects.
Well, in fact, though, just on Saturday, we're launching a major project with the Trump administration. So this is the Women's Entrepreneurship Financing Initiative. This is an idea that was actually brought to me by Ivanka Trump, and she wanted to do something that would support women entrepreneurs in developing countries. And so we did about 4 months of fundraising, and it was the fastest fundraising we've ever seen, $350 million from 15 countries.
So Mrs. Trump is going to join the board of the World Bank and tell you what to do?
Not at all, not at all. So what Ivanka told us is that she doesn't want to have anything to do with the running or the fund. That will go through our usual channels.
Right.
But she's going to be a mentor. Yeah. She's going to actually provide mentoring to women in developing countries who are trying to start their businesses. And so that's, you know, we have found lots of different ways. We're talking to them about infrastructure. We're talking to them about various approaches to private sector development to tackle difficulties.
Before
and so we're working.
A surveillance correction, I said Mrs. Trump, and I should have said Mrs. Kushner, I'll be in trouble. Let's switch to something serious, and this goes to the heart of your expertise. Most of our viewers and listeners don't know that you and your team in the 90s changed the dialogue on tuberculosis. I would suggest you've never gotten the credit for that you should, that you changed the way we handle this horrific disease worldwide. Now bring it forward to refugees and migrants, and we can take any nation, but Myanmar is really front and center right now. Tell me about the linkage of the World Bank and health and this horrific new thrust of refugees and migrants.
Yeah. So, you know, one of the things that the Human Capital Project will show is that countries don't invest in their people at their great peril. If they refrain from investing in their people, if they find excuses, if they say they're going to spend money on other things, it is at their great peril. Right? And so the situation for refugees is that if we don't invest in the health and education of refugees, we also do so at our own great peril, because the young people who don't have a chance, who are not educated, who cannot compete in the digital economy of the future, I worry that they're going to become the nidus of fragility, conflict, violence, extremism. So we have to step forward. Now, to go back to what I've been doing in the past, for 20 years, we've been arguing that, we need more grant money, we need more donor financing, and that's all been great. What we're doing now with the Human Capital Project is to say, look, heads of state, look, ministers of finance, we're going to put out a ranking about where you stand in terms of your stock of human capital and what you're doing to increase the flow, increase your human capital, and where you come out on this list may very well determine how quickly you grow. That will change, I think, the dynamic from one in which the developing countries wait for the supply of funds to come to one in which they're demanding the best way to improve their human capital. That's what we have to create.
Take that over to one country, again, Burma, Myanmar as well. How does the World Bank, as this ginormous institution, how do you deal with one country, whether it's the border of Turkey and Syria, or it's what we've seen over the last 6 months in Myanmar?
So we're very concerned about what's happening in Myanmar. I've issued a statement on it. And very specifically, what we're doing is we're continuing our lending for programs around health, education, social protection, and especially in Rakhine State. So we're very focused on supporting the poor in Myanmar. But we had another operation, a major budget support operation, which we can't go forward with right now because we're very concerned about what's happening there. And so we're working hand in glove with Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, and we want to make it clear that what is happening there is not acceptable. And so while we continue to support health and education because we don't think we can lose ground, we can't go forward with the budget support.
Help me with infrastructure. It's been a buzzword. I see McKinsey doing work on it, and I see the World Economic Forum doing work on it. But you guys, and this goes back to my childhood, you are the ultimate and original post-World War II infrastructure organization. How do you approach modern infrastructure away from creating fresh water of 30 and 40 years ago?
So the traditional approach has been that on the public sector side, we provide loans to which countries provide sovereign guarantees, and we go forward with the infrastructure. On the private sector side, we provide loans to private sector companies. We're changing that practice in a pretty fundamental way because the real opportunity in the world, both for investors and for developing countries, is to get the 10 plus trillion in negative interest rate bonds, the 24 plus trillion in very low earning government bonds, and the 8 trillion in cash, sitting, €1,000 bills sitting in people's safes. Get that off the sideline by de-risking investments. And we're doing it in a lot of different ways. Sometimes we create debt instruments where we take 10% first loss, and then the senior tranche becomes BBB. Right. We can do things like provide political risk insurance if people are afraid that a company might be nationalized. We think if we can start bringing the sovereign wealth funds and the pension funds off the sideline, this will be a huge new source of investment capital. And we just signed an MOU with a Japanese pension fund, the largest pension fund in the world, 1.4 trillion.
He's different than when he was at Dartmouth. He didn't know what an MOU was. Is that an understanding thing?
We knew what MOUs were, but we didn't know what a BBB senior tranche was.
Two more questions. We got to get this in. You parachuted into Iowa as a child. You are the absolute walking personification of the success of modern immigration in America. How do you speak to a wall on the Mexican border? How do you speak to the new form of immigration debate in America?
Just to point out that of the great Fortune 100 companies of 30 years ago, 30% were started by immigrants or the children of immigrants. Of the high-tech companies that have just dominated the U.S. economy, 40% were started by immigrants or the children of immigrants. The majority of Nobel Prize winners, U.S. Nobel Prize winners, were born outside of the country. And last year, of the 6 Nobel Prize winners who were American citizens, all of them were born outside the country, as was I. So I think immigrants can play a huge role. And what we're trying to do is to change the narrative. Immigration is good. Japan needs immigrants. Korea desperately needs immigrants to fuel the next phase of their economic growth. We want to change that dialogue in a pretty fundamental way.
You look fresh and relaxed. You've had a wonderful 24 hours. Madame Lagarde's been a piñata with the Trump administration. They're going after her on tax reform and other IMF-like initiatives. Defend Madame Lagarde right now. She's doing it. Is she doing it right on poking into countries' tax reform issues?
Let me just say this. I've worked so closely with Christine Lagarde for the last 5 years. I think she's one of the great leaders in the world today. She has a way of dealing with very difficult situations with grace, with clarity, and I see no evidence that this particular interaction will go in any different sort of way.